Prep Test 23, Section 2, Question 4. The reasoning in the argument is questionable because of what? This is a flaw question. So I'm going to find the conclusion and the support, and I'm going to try to figure out why the support isn't enough to prove the conclusion. All right, a political scientist says the concept of freedom is hopelessly vague. Any definition of freedom will either exclude some acts that intuitively qualify as free or admit some acts that intuitively fall outside the concept. The notions of justice, fairness, and equality are equally indeterminate. This is why, so when it says this is why, it's saying these ideas that they have posited, these claims that they've made, are the reason behind the statement they're about to make. So that makes this the conclusion, and all of this is support. Right. So that's just based on like the grammar connecting those ideas, right? Okay. This is why political organization should be disavowed as futile. So immediately to me, I'm confused because they haven't mentioned political organization previously. They haven't mentioned a goal. So if you're going to say that something is futile, then you might be looking at, well, it's impossible to achieve, so it's pointless to try, something like that. There might be some connection there, but they haven't actually talked about like even a goal of political organization, that the goal would be to somehow either create an intuitive definition of freedom, or an intuitive definition of justice, fairness, or equality, or to abide by that definition or anything like that. They really haven't connected the dots for us at all. This feels like it comes out of nowhere. And it's a very strong statement as well. You're going to get a lot of conclusions on arguments on the LSAT that are very strong statements, and that are not supported in that strength, right? The arguments are flawed because their conclusions are not supported by the evidence that's provided. In this case, there's really no link that I can think of that they have made, right? I can try to create one, but that's just a bunch of assumptions. So yeah, I'm essentially looking for, like, they haven't connected these ideas for me in any way. And especially with a word like should, like making that kind of like strong value statement about what's right, what ought to be the case. Yeah, I would certainly be a bit a bit wary of thinking that anything apart from a conditional statement about, like, if these conditions are met, then this is what should happen as a result, that anything other than like a principle like that in a premise isn't going to be enough to prove a conclusion that says what should happen. Or you would need something that talks about what is good and right versus what is not. And in this, they just kind of talk about how these things are hopelessly vague. So I do wonder if maybe the futility and the hopelessness is what they're kind of trying to connect there. But to say that something is hopelessly vague doesn't mean that some other thing should be disavowed as futile. Those are, yes, those two words are related, hopeless and futile, but they're describing and modifying two totally different concepts that are not related to each other or connected to each other in the argument in any other way. So does it generalize from an unrepresentative sample to every political idea? So they actually aren't talking about political ideas even in the conclusion, right? Like they're talking about organization. B, makes the unsupported claim that the concept of freedom is hopelessly vague. So it absolutely does do that, but that's an issue of external validity rather than internal validity. And I should correct myself there. It doesn't actually make that as an unsupported claim. It supports that claim with the second sentence. C, ignores the fact that some people view freedom as indispensable. That's not actually a flaw. So when you're creating an argument, you don't have to take into account every person's view of the ideas that you have in that argument. Yeah, just because there would be some people who would disagree with you doesn't mean that you have to address that in your argument. And it wouldn't necessarily make your argument flawed, right? Just because there might be people who would disagree with it. And this isn't even directly opposed to anything in the argument. Okay. D, fails to show any specific link between the vagueness of concepts such as freedom and the rejection of political organization. Yeah, absolutely, right? So concepts versus organization, because it's vague, why do we have to like reject this other thing? There's no link. And then the last one is saying that the reasoning in the argument is questionable because the argument is mounted by someone who has a vested interest in the rejection of political organization. So this, if we were to actually say that the argument is questionable because of that, we would be attacking the individual making the argument rather than attacking the argument itself. So we would be engaging in an ad hominem attack there. To attack or to try to attack the reasoning by going after the individual, even if we were able to show that that individual has some bias, right? That they would benefit from convincing us of their conclusion, that doesn't address whether or not their argument is sound, right? So someone could have a vested interest in getting us to agree with their conclusion, and likely they have some motive for wanting to argue in favor of that conclusion, right? The key is, do they present their premises, their evidence, their support? Do they present that in such a way that this argument has internal validity, right? That the conclusion actually follows from those premises. We can certainly deal with that bias by making sure that that evidence is sound, right? And all of that, but like we can't just ignore the argument, ignore the reasoning, ignore the evidence because of the person making the argument and their potential motives. Here as well, we have no evidence that this person has a vested interest in the rejection of political organization. In fact, as a political scientist, you would think that they would have a vested interest in the opposite, the continued like proliferation of political organizations, because that would give them more to study and to comment on. So that also doesn't make very much sense. So D should be the correct answer here. Okay. Next one, question 7 from the same section. Which one of the following is most strongly supported by the information above? So in this case, we're not necessarily looking at an argument. So information doesn't imply that there is a structure to the sentences above where we have a conclusion that's supported by premises. So my first step would not be to identify the conclusion, as it would be in a flaw question or a strengthen or weaken or assumption question. With this one, I just want to take all of the information as if it's 100% true, and then look at the answer choices and say, which one of the following is most likely to be true if I take all of that information to be 100% true. So yeah, I'm not looking to like summarize the information, but just say that information is true. Does this thing also have to be true because of that? Computers perform actions that are closer to thinking than anything non-human animals do. But computers do not have volitional powers, although some non-human animals do. Okay, so we have two kind of contrasting statements, and they both seem to be talking about like a capacity that human animals have, right? That humans have to think, or the having volition. And then saying like, can computers do this? Can non-human animals do this? And yeah, there's a contrast there. Okay. Having volitional powers need not involve thinking. So in order to support this, we would just have to have an example of a being that has volitional powers, but cannot think or doesn't do anything that we could consider thinking. And we do actually have that, right? So we know that some non-human animals do have volitional powers, and we know that computers perform actions closer to thinking than anything non-human animals do. And so that would suggest that none of those entities, so computers and non-human animals, neither of them actually do think. Computers are closer to it than non-human animals, but they don't even quite do it yet. So we know that there are some non-human animals that have volitional powers, and we know that there are no non-human animals that can think according to these premises, right? Doesn't have to be true empirically, right? We could have like external information that shows that those things are false, but we're going to take these things, this information as true, and see which of these things would be most strongly supported. A seems pretty strongly supported. B, things that are not animals do not have volitional powers. We only know about computers and some non-human animals. So we can't say anything about other things that are not animals. So we'd have to eliminate that. We might be able to support that based on outside information, but we can't support it with the information above. Computers possess none of the attributes of living things. And we also can't say that. They perform actions that are closer to thinking than anything non-human animals do. So that seems to be at least approaching an attribute of humans. But also, based on that information, we know one thing that computers do and one thing that computers don't have. We don't know everything about the attributes of computers, and we can't compare them to all of the attributes of living things because that's not within the scope of that information. D, it is necessary to have volitional powers in order to think. So this would create a conditional relationship where we have a necessary condition of volitional powers for thinking, where volitional powers are required for thinking, and we don't have anything in the information that actually sets up that conditional relationship. So it doesn't say if you're a thinking being, then you must have volitional powers. We don't know that. It doesn't say if you don't have volitional powers, then you're incapable of thinking. Yeah, so that wouldn't be supported. E, computers will never be able to think as human beings do. You might believe that that's true. You might believe that that's false. But it is not supported by the information that we have. We have information about what computers can currently do, and we don't have any information that would allow us to predict, and certainly not something that would allow us to predict so strongly what computers will or will not be able to do in the future. Question 8. Which one of the following, if it were discovered to be true, would most seriously undermine the argument? So in this case, we are looking to undermine or weaken the argument. We do have an argument here, which means that the ideas are arranged where some of the ideas support another idea, and the ideas that are doing the supporting are the premises, and the idea that is supported is the conclusion. So it's good to look for the structure when we are presented with an argument in the stimulus. We have a great conclusion indicator word, the word therefore, and then we even have it can be concluded that, right? So we have this whole phrase that tells us what the conclusion is. Okay. We do have a support indicator word in here, but what I'm thinking is that the conclusion itself is saying that we know what the explanation is for this observation that we have. So that explanation, because of its visual resemblance, that part is part of the conclusion, because the conclusion is claiming this is the explanation. It can be concluded that its visual resemblance to the monarch is the explanation for why the viceroy is so seldom preyed on, right? So I don't think that their main conclusion is simply that the viceroy is so seldom preyed on. I think that would, if that were their conclusion, then it would probably say the viceroy is seldom preyed on rather than is so seldom preyed on. But also the evidence that supports it would be like data about how often the viceroy is preyed on, rather than potential explanations about its connection to the monarch, and maybe why the monarch doesn't have a lot of predators, or things like that. So even though we do have the word because within the conclusion, it's not indicating support for the conclusion. It's actually part of the claim that they're trying to support. All right. The caterpillar of the monarch butterfly feeds on milkweed plants, whose toxins make the adult monarch poisonous to many predators. Okay, the caterpillar of the monarch butterfly feeds on milkweed plants, whose toxins make the adult monarch poisonous to many predators. The viceroy butterfly, whose caterpillars do not feed on milkweed plants, is very similar in appearance to the monarch. All right. And based on this, they're saying that the reason that the viceroy is so seldom preyed on is because it looks like the monarch. So they're kind of ignoring the possibility that the viceroy could itself be toxic or poisonous, right? That the viceroy, maybe it doesn't, feed on the milkweed plants, right? Or its caterpillars don't, but maybe it feeds on some other kind of plant that has toxins and makes it toxic or poisonous, right? So that would be something that they're kind of ignoring, right? So the way that they're setting it up is trying to make us think that having your caterpillars feed on milkweed plants is not only something that would make you poisonous to many predators, but that it's the only way that you could become poisonous to many predators. And also, they're making it seem like the only way that you could be, seldom preyed on is if predators are avoiding you because they think that you're poisonous, or because of natural selection, where avoiding you means they're also going to avoid other things that look like you, and therefore they're going to avoid something poisonous. And so this is one of those things where they're just focusing so much on this relationship between the monarch butterfly feeding on the milkweed, toxins, poisonous, and then the similarity in appearance, that they're ignoring just like the myriad of other possibilities as to why the viceroy might be so seldom preyed on. Yeah, I would look to that. I would look to strengthening any other possible explanation as to why a butterfly, or specifically the viceroy, could be seldom preyed on. You could even go really specific and like maybe the butterfly, like the viceroy butterfly feeds on the milkweed plants somehow and becomes toxic, right? We know the caterpillars of the viceroy don't feed on milkweed plants, but we haven't even ruled out that the adult butterfly would feed on them. So to say that we know what the explanation is, we would have to rule out any other possible explanation. So what I'm doing here is I'm showing like this big gap in this argument that they have definitely not ruled out all the other explanations before coming to their conclusion. And when we're trying to weaken the argument, we want to take advantage of that gap, right? So we're going to kind of lean in on that flaw. Okay, so answer choice A. Some predators do not have a toxic reaction to insects that feed on milkweed plants. Right, so we do know that many predators are find this poisonous, right? But some don't have that toxic reaction. I mean, it doesn't say that the viceroy is never preyed on, so it's totally possible that there are some predators still. So this doesn't really undermine the argument. It could coexist with the conclusion and we'd be fine. B, being toxic to predators will not protect individual butterflies unless most members of the species to which such butterflies belong are similarly toxic. Yeah, so I mean here, this is going to be a problem, right? So they're basically saying that that toxicity isn't going to protect you just because you look like other butterflies. It's only going to protect you if you belong to a species where the members are similarly toxic. So even being toxic yourself as an individual butterfly won't help you unless more than half of the members of your species are similarly toxic. So yeah, visual resemblance doesn't look like it's going to be an explanation here. So I would think, yeah, B is quite a strong answer. C, Some of the predators of the monarch butterfly also prey on viceroys. Again, we just have some predators, and that still can coexist with the conclusion. Just because something is seldom preyed on doesn't mean it has zero predators. So having a few predators, not going to make a difference there. D, the viceroy butterfly is toxic to most predators. This one definitely weakens the connection, right? So that would be a much better explanation for why it's so seldom preyed on, rather than just its visual resemblance to a toxic butterfly would be that it's toxic itself. And toxicity to predators is the principal means of protection for only a few butterfly species. I'm not really worried about how many butterfly species use toxicity as the principal means of protection. That's not really going to help or hurt this argument. So I would be looking between B and D. Yeah, I like D better than B because it actually talks about the butterfly that we care about, and it gives us an alternative explanation for why the viceroy is so seldom preyed on. Yeah, so I would go with D. Yeah, B talks about if you are toxic, whether you will be protected or not. And at this point, we don't know whether or not the viceroy is toxic. And so with this one, like, we're having to connect it in order to make it relevant to weaken. Whereas with D, it's relevant to weaken immediately because it gives us an alternate explanation to the one that's offered in the conclusion. Yeah. And there's nothing about D that actually conflicts with the information in the premises, right? Because in the premises, all we know is that the caterpillars don't feed on milkweed plants. We don't know that there isn't some other way that that butterfly could become toxic to predators. So, yeah. So a lot of kind of longer explanations for these questions, but hopefully that can help, and hopefully that will spark some ideas when you're doing other similar questions. Yeah. Let me know if you have any follow-ups.